He was never supposed to lead, never supposed to rule, never supposed to speak more than a few lines. And yet he became something larger than life, a phantom in the galaxy, a ghost with a jetpack, a myth sculpted from metal and silence. Boba Fett was the kind of character who didn't need a backstory. His presence was the story. His shadow was louder than his voice, his stare more dangerous than any weapon. And in the spaces between scenes, he lived forever, untouched by failure, untouched by time. But legends are fragile. They do not shatter from impact. They erode from neglect, from misunderstanding, from stories that forget why we ever cared. And when his story finally arrived, it came not as a storm, but as a stutter, hesitant, confused, incomplete. He was no longer a symbol of fear, but a man explaining himself, negotiating with strangers, wandering aimlessly through sand and memory. The armor still shined, but the weight behind it was gone. The silence was no longer power. It was emptiness. And before we could ask why, the spotlight turned away, handed to another, to a man who had nothing to prove and everything to gain. And just like that, Boba Fett faded again. Not in fire, not in glory, but in awkward smiles and wasted time. In this video, we explore how the book of Boba Fett betrayed its own name, how it misunderstood the myth, how it sidelined a legend before it ever truly honored him. We break down the mistakes, the missteps, the meaning lost in translation, and why Boba Fett deserved a story as powerful as the silence that once made him timeless. There was a time when Boba Fett was a myth, a shadow that haunted the edges of every frame, a name whispered by smugglers and feared by warlords. He had few lines, but every silence was louder than words. Every stare was a promise. Every move was precise. He was not a hero, not a villain, just inevitability in Mandalorian armor. You saw him, and you knew someone was going to die. Someone was going to pay. Someone was going to vanish without a trace. That was the legend. That was the man. And so we waited, for decades, to finally see him rise again. To take center stage. To step out of the smoke and claim what was his. A throne built from debt and dread. A legacy forged in fire. When they announced the book of Boba Fett, the galaxy held its breath. We thought we would see the past sharpen into the present. We thought the quiet would finally speak. We thought the myth would become flesh again. But when the story unfolded, what we found was not the hunter, not the blade, not the ghost, but something slower, something softer, something unsure of itself. And in that shift, something broke. Boba Fett was once the embodiment of control. In the original trilogy, he said, little moved less, and still dominated every room. He was sharp, decisive, efficient. But in his own show, he stumbled, he waited, he begged, he spoke in circles, made deals that went nowhere, gathered allies with no urgency, led with no fire. The same man who once stood toe-to-toe with Darth Vader now struggled to manage thugs in an alley. The edge was gone, replaced by awkward pauses and strange choices. The series wanted to show growth, but forgot who he was to begin with. You cannot evolve a legend if you first erase what made him legendary. He did not need to be redefined. He needed to be respected. The pacing dragged, the dialogue meandered, and the structure felt confused. Scenes lingered too long on side characters. Filler became foundation, and Boba became a background piece in his own saga. And before the season even found its footing, it surrendered completely, handing the spotlight to Din Djarin, as if even the writers knew Boba was no longer carrying the weight of the show. And worse, no longer allowed to. There is nothing more painful than watching a legend fade without purpose. Not because the story ended, but because it never began. We did not need Boba Fett to be perfect. We needed him to be himself. He survived the Sarlacc, and that should have been his rebirth. His fire reignited, his hunger sharpened. Instead, he wandered the desert, not as a predator, but as a drifter, unsure of his own name. The potential was immense. A bounty hunter turned warlord, haunted by history, grappling with power, carving a code out of chaos. But none of that came through. Only half-hearted attempts. Only fragments of emotion with no center. Even the flashbacks felt hollow, stretched too thin. Aimed at humanizing a man who was already compelling without explanation. He did not need to change to be interesting. He just needed to be challenged. Instead, the show gave us long silences and sudden detours. It gave us moments that should have mattered, but passed like shadows. And in the end, it left Boba, not as a ruler, not as a myth, but as a missed opportunity. What makes it all worse is what could have been. Imagine Boba walking into Jabba's palace with the fire of vengeance in his chest. Imagine him turning underworld chaos into order. Not with politics, but with precision. Picture a city ruled by fear and respect. A man balancing mercy and menace with every word. Picture old enemies crawling from the sands. debts long buried being repaid in blood, alliances built through grit, not awkward nods and hollow threats. He could have been a storm in slow motion, a ruler forged not by tradition, but by survival. A warrior king who carried his scars like trophies, who turned pain into empire, who ruled because he earned it. We could have seen the galaxy's criminal web tremble as Boba returned, not as a relic, but as a force reborn, not as an administrator, but as an architect of something brutal and beautiful. Instead, we got speederbike teens, half-finished politics, and a story afraid to let him bite. The AEW was replaced with awkwardness. The promise was buried under protocol. The legend faded beneath the dust. But maybe all is not lost. Maybe the ashes still carry heat. Maybe the name Boba Fett still means something. If given the chance, if given the right story, he could rise again. Not as an echo of what came before, but as the embodiment of what never got to breathe. Legends do not die from bad writing alone. They sleep. They wait. They listen for silence to pass. And when the galaxy forgets, when memory fades, that is when they strike again. Not for revenge, but for remembrance. Boba Fett still wears the armor. Not for fashion, not for nostalgia, but because it is his skin, his shield. His identity forged in fire and failure. The scars are still there, not just on his face, but deep within the myth, waiting to be honored. He does not need redemption. He needs recognition. Not from his enemies, not even from fans, but from the creators who dared to tell his story without knowing who he truly was. He needs a writer who understands silence, who understands power without posing, who understands what it means to walk into a room and say nothing, but own everything. We do not need him to smile, or to govern, or to soften. We need him to haunt again, to strike again, to move like a ghost with purpose, to rise from the depths, not as a man confused, but as a legend reborn, cold, clean, unrelenting. And when that happens, when the mask tilts just so, when the blaster fires just once, we will remember why the galaxy once feared his name. The Book of Boba Fett did not evolve his story. It unraveled it. It stripped away the mystique, the menace, the meaning. It turned a silent hunter into a confused bystander, and then replaced him entirely, like he had no voice, no legacy, no reason to remain in the frame. It promised us a throne, but gave us a chair. It promised war, but gave us waiting. It promised character, but gave us cameos. And somewhere in that shuffle, in that hesitation, the man behind the helmet disappeared. Not with a bang, but with a shrug. Boba Fett was never supposed to be everything, but he was never supposed to be nothing. He was myth made real, fear given form, a character who demanded respect without demanding attention. He deserved a story built on intensity, not indecision, a return framed by vengeance, not negotiation. Instead, his name became a title for a show that barely remembered him, that let others steal the light, that dimmed him before he could even burn. It turned the page halfway through, wrote someone else's story on top of his, and never turned back, leaving Boba not as a legend reclaimed, but a shadow erased.